Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's agreed that we are in a moment of real danger and real change. Trump, as people have talked about, expresses the kind of definitive end of what we've all experienced over the last 40 years, capitalist globalisation, and a much more aggressive, reactionary and repressive form of kind of national capitalist competition. And I think there's two risks at a time like this in terms of how the left responds. One is that it feels just overwhelming, that we feel there's a flood tide to the right and there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. The other is the kind of flip side of that response, which is that, oh, this is going to wake everyone up, and that's going to lead to a situation where mass resistance is going to spontaneously develop. Now, I think neither of those positions actually captures exactly the situation we're in, and both of them rule out of the equation what is in many ways the most important thing, which actually we don't spend enough time talking about, which is why we're having this as the final plenary. What exactly is it that the left should be doing? And this is, you know, obviously we're not going to be able to resolve this question here, but this is an ongoing and vitally important discussion, I think. And getting it right depends on having a quite precise, concrete grasp of the realities that we're living in. And clearly, in Britain, the far right is a problem. The rise of reform, Pamela's mentioned it, others have mentioned it, it's a serious threat. But I think it's important also to stress the point Kevin made earlier, that we're not living in 1930s Germany at the moment. That is not where we are. Most people in British society, and no doubt in most countries in the world, are appalled by Donald Trump, are absolutely disgusted by Nigel Farage for that matter, and all of the values that they espouse. In Britain, if you look at the polls, there's basically a social democratic consciousness amongst the vast majority of working people. People support the NHS, support welfare, they want less inequality, they want more trade union rights, and so on and so forth. That is the base in terms of real opinion on the ground. And the central problem is, or certainly a very important part of the problem, in Britain and elsewhere, is that people who used to call themselves the left or socialists, or used to be regarded as that, have collapsed, have surrendered in the face of the move towards more right-wing politics, and obviously Starmer is at the forefront of that process. And this is an elementary mistake. It's an absolute, you know, it's a child's error, really, that chasing the right can only strengthen them. It can only strengthen right-wing ideas in society, and it will be the real right that benefits from that process. And crucially, it won't stop Labour looking like it is defending the status quo in reality, which is exactly where the right wing want them to be, and is the key to the situation. Reform is actually level or consistently around about, in some cases in the polls, ahead of Labour. But this is mainly, and look at the polls, this is mainly because people are saying they just can't stomach voting for Labour anymore. And secondly, it's because, in fact, there's a very interesting poll that came out in January, a YouGov poll that came out in January, which shows that the main reason working people vote for reform is because they're not Labour and they're not the Conservatives. That is a much more important reason than actually supporting their policies on immigration. That's the situation that we're in, and we clearly need to do everything we can. One of the priorities of the left clearly has to be to challenge their racism, challenge their reactionary politics, obviously at the same time confront Tommy Robinson and the real hard right fascists on the streets. But we also have to understand some of the points Pamela made, that people want change, people are suffering, people feel rightly that Britain is broken and reform presents itself as a new direction. And actually what we need to do is to show them that the direction leads nowhere, and to show them that the left really can provide a direction that provides some sort of solutions for people. The second thing I want to say is that there is actually a big left in this country, which is not something that people on the left, funny enough, say that much, but actually it's true. Corbynism showed there was a big left, and a left that could actually project and relate to millions and millions of people in this country. Corbynism itself came out of the anti-war movement, the anti-austerity movement, which mobilised hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. And the left has clearly been absolutely central to the Palestine movement, which has mobilised actually millions of people again, and has been instrumental in winning the arguments in society about this critical question, which was something that many people thought we could never do, create a situation where the majority of people support Palestine and understand that Israel is the problem in the Middle East. And we're now in a situation where only 6% of the population actually support what Israel is doing. Now, to be effective, I think the left has to understand we have to take the arguments on board, that we have to be clear about breaking from the establishment consensus and show that we're serious about change, about really fighting for change in the here and now and fighting for a different type of society. And I just want to finish by saying, for me, there's 3 registers in which this operation needs to take place. The first is that we need to build the kind of mass resistance that has been built over Palestine. We need to carry on strengthening the Palestinian movement, but we need to build the kind of movement we built over Palestine, over the cost of living crisis, over austerity, over the NHS, over welfare. These are, that seems to me to be the absolutely first point. Whether or not we respond to the attacks with mass movements is absolutely critical. Who wasn't cheering? Who didn't heave a sigh of relief when they saw 250,000 people marching through the streets of Berlin in the run-up to the AfD, the potentially successful AfD bid for at least second place? Imagine a situation if we hadn't had the Palestine movement in this country. The reality we would be living in would be much more, much bleaker, and therefore we have to think about building the Palestine movement, but also building those kinds of movements over the wider drive toward the cost of living crisis and the new austerity. And that's something that can be done, to be honest. It's a task the left needs to set itself. It won't be hard if we seriously pull together a kind of united front operation around the NHS, around pay, around defending our schools. That would resonate. I'm absolutely convinced if we pulled that kind of coalition together, it would resonate very strongly. It's a united front strategy. It's revolutionaries joining with non-revolutionaries to focus around the key issues of the moment, build street movements that can penetrate into the workplaces and communities and build real resistance. And the advantages of those things are they overcome the atomisation and the powerlessness people feel. They create the sense, which is absolutely critical, that the left is shaping society. The left is making some difference to what is going on. And that seems to me to be the first task. The second thing is, I agree that parliamentary politics matters. Of course it does. To most people, Parliament is politics, in a certain sense. Even though there is a great deal of scepticism and cynicism about the political elites, nevertheless it is very important. It would be great to have a bigger group of independent, left of Labour, socialist MPs organising together, partly, in fact mainly, because it would strengthen potentially the movements on the ground and it would make it easier to promote socialist ideas. But there are 2 issues, I feel, with the whole question of parliamentary politics. One is, and Yanis, if he's still here, could maybe attest to this, the record of the parliamentary left, the radical parliamentary left in Europe over the last few years has not been fantastic. In particular, there's always a danger that an electoral left can become a kind of substitute for the sort of mass politics on the ground that I believe are central to a kind of transformation. And even during the Corbyn years, I have to say that a lot of activists who had been engaged in building the movement on the ground, the anti-war movement, the anti-austerity movement, turned their attention to parliamentary politics almost exclusively. And I think Corbynism itself suffered from that process. The second problem with the whole parliamentary, I'm all in favour of it. I'm all in favour of bringing together those people who want a new parliamentary left. I think it's the most difficult form of politics, actually, to create unity with. I think it's a very fragmented, very competitive field of politics, the electoral field. And in some ways, we're seeing that now. There are a whole lot of different projects. One of the most disappointing things for me was the response of the Socialist Campaign Group to the fact that some of their members were excluded from the Labour Party. I thought that that was a moment when they should have got together. I mean, if those people had at that point said, OK, we're joining with Jeremy Corbyn, the 4 or 5 independents, we're going to form a new organisation. I believe that organisation would have had hundreds of thousands of members within weeks or months, and I think that tells you something about the difficulties of the terrain of parliamentary politics. So I do think that as Counterfire we're very much committed to this idea of trying to pull together a new parliamentary party. But I actually think that the circumstances in which that is most likely to be accelerated are ones in which we build big movements on the ground. I mean, the 5 independents, they came out of the Palestine movement. Corbynism itself, I believe, did come out of the anti-austerity movement and the big street movements before in the past. I want to end with the third register in which I think we have to operate on, which is actually the construction of what would inevitably initially be smaller, but I think is absolutely decisive, is radical socialist organisation that builds within the movements. Because the paradox here is that to create these kind of unities, to create these kind of mass movements, you need a bunch of people, a bunch of activists, a bunch of militants in different workplaces and communities who see mass protest, who see participatory politics, who see the politics of working people fighting for themselves, unleashing the creativity and the militancy of working class people themselves as being the absolute key. All the big protest movements that we've experienced over the last 20, 30 years, they've all been initiated by the revolutionary left. That's the truth. The poll tax campaign, the great anti-racist campaigns, the Stop the War coalition, the anti-austerity movements, they bring together millions of working people from all sorts of different political backgrounds, but they're initiated by those people who understand that change fundamentally comes from below. And that's why I think the third element, and a crucial element of what we need to be doing, is talking about strengthening that radical left, talking about strengthening the revolutionary organisation in society. And faced with an establishment that is at the moment united in support of a genocide, shockingly, faced with authorities criminalising protesters and a Labour government crawling to Donald Trump as they impose austerity and as the world burns, we have, I believe, a once-in-a-generation opportunity of building that kind of revolutionary left again, and I think it's an opportunity we should seize.
Thank you very much.